Hello everyone, and I welcome you all to this video on PMP training where I'll be covering the key concepts of project management. So my mission here with this mini course is to make the project management very easy to understand for you. So what I will do here in this video is I will try and start from the very first process that you should do in your project, right from the initiation phase all the way to the project closure. So my name is Pawan. I've got my PMP certification a couple of years ago. I've handled multiple projects under various domains, so I should be able to provide you with the simple examples while I explain the concepts of PMP. See, if you take a look at the PMBOK guide, the Project Management Body of Knowledge, the 6th edition, it's around 1,000 pages long. And the initial reaction would be like, oh my God, that's a heavy content and a lot to cover. But trust me, it would be pretty easy for you to go through the entire book if you try and understand the fundamentals, which I will try and explain in this video. So this video is pretty much for anybody who's going to take up the PMP certification in the near future. So I would try and take you through the entire 49 processes, right from, like I mentioned earlier, from the initiation phase all the way to the project closure. So without further ado, let's get straight into the course.
All right, then let's get started with the simplified version of Project Management Professional extracted from PMBOK 6th edition. Now, if you take a look at the PMBOK guide, it has 13 chapters in total. And the first 3 chapters are generic, wherein the first one essentially talks about what is a project and project management overall. And the second chapter is all about the organization structure and how it will change depending on how much leverage you give on the project. The third one talks about the project manager and mostly on the PMI triangle and the competencies of the project manager. And between the chapter 4 up to chapter 13, we have 10 knowledge areas in total. So I will take you through some of the key concepts here only to start with, and then we shall go through the processes and how they're connected or integrated with each other. Okay, let's start with the most fundamental question you can ask yourself. What is a project? A project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or a result. So if you take any project, ultimately you get some outcome in the end, right? And that will be unique, whether it's a product, service, or a result. So that's a simple definition according to PMI. Now, what are some of the characteristics of a project? It has a definite start and an end date, which means you complete the project in a given defined schedule or a timeline. It usually follows something called as a progressive elaboration. Now, what is a progressive elaboration? It is basically a technique where the plan of any given project is being constantly modified and improved, as and when you have more information that becomes available. So when the project proceeds, you will have more improved information, right? Which will help modify and improve the plan even better. So that's the basic definition of a progressive elaboration. Now, like I discussed earlier, it creates a unique product, service, or a result. So now that we know the definition of a project and the characteristics of it, let's understand what is the difference between a project and an operation. Let me explain this with a very simple example. Let's say you've been given a project to build a car manufacturing facility, and your job is completed, which is building the manufacturing unit. And once that is done, the client has started manufacturing the cars. In this example, building the facility is an example of a project. And once the facility starts working and the car manufacturing starts, that's the example of an operation. Because here the facility is producing a repetitive output, which is cars, right? So that's the basic difference between a project and an operation. A project is a temporary one, and operations are ongoing or ongoing. A project creates something unique product, whereas the operations has a standard product, and operation is indefinite, whereas project has a specific start and an end date. Now let's understand what is the difference between a project, program, and a portfolio. Like I already mentioned earlier, what is the definition of a project? Let's understand what is a portfolio and a program. Now, if you take a look at this pyramid, a project is rolling up to a program is further rolling up to a portfolio, which is a part of the strategic goals of an organization. Now, we all know what a project is, right? I've explained it earlier. So the program is a group of related projects. The keyword here is a related project, remember that. And a portfolio is a collection of projects and a program that is grouped together to meet the strategic goals of an organization. Now pay attention to this. A project and a program basically focuses on a program and a project in a right way. It's basically focused on doing the projects and program in the right way. Whereas a portfolio management focuses on doing the right program. Do you get the basic difference? So that's the basic difference between a project, program, and a portfolio. Now, let me take you through a very important concept called a constraint. To understand what project constraints are, let me give you a simple analogy. So, if you ask me how the project manager's performance is judged or reviewed, I would say it's based on how well or how the project manager is overall managing all the constraints. So as you see, there are totally 6 constraints that we talk about: scope, time, cost, resources, risk, and quality. Now they're all called constraints because even if you change one of them, at least another one will get affected. Like for example, if you increase the scope of the project, the cost may go up. And if you don't increase the cost, but the scope was increased, then the risk may go up, and eventually the quality may go down. You see the difference? You see how they are interconnected and linked? So the effective project manager should know how to balance and play around with these constraints to get the best outcome of the project. Okay, now, like I mentioned earlier, the rest of the basic concepts of project management are, the roles and responsibility of the project manager, project management. What is a project management office, the PMO, the various types of organization structures like functional organization, strong matrix, balanced, weak matrix, and projectized organization. And other simple concepts are very self-explanatory, which you can go through PMBOK guide and understand. Okay, then let's talk about the process chart. This is really, really important, guys, for you to understand for your upcoming PMP exam. This process chart is more like a skeleton of the PMBOK guide. If you see, what PMBOK does is it takes each of the knowledge areas, the ones that you see on the left, integration all the way to stakeholder, and explain them in much more details. And essentially what this chart tells you is how PMI wants you to manage the projects. So across the columns, you have 5 process groups on the top, and along the rows, we have the knowledge areas, and intersection between them are the 49 processes. Now, for the sake of ease, I have color coded them. The ones that you see in red are the ones which is added new. The manage project knowledge, control resources, and implement risk responses are all the new processes that's been added. Now, estimate activity resources was under time management. It moved to resource management. Now, all the ones that are in blue, like schedule, resource, and the rest of them they have changed the nomenclature, the naming convention. Like schedule was called as time and resource was called as human resources. Let's begin with the first process group, initiating. Now, why will any organization undertake a project? What drives to initiate the project? Sometimes the projects are initiated to drive change, like for example, an agile transformation project. Sometimes the projects are initiated to enable business value creation, be it a tangible or intangible value, like launching a new product. And sometimes projects are undertaken to meet the regulatory requirements. Or sometimes the service improvement is required, hence we initiate a project, or even a technological advancement. Likewise, there are multiple needs or requirements why we undertake or initiate a project. So basically, this process group has 2 processes: develop project charter and identify stakeholder. Now, what you see at the bottom right-hand corner of this rectangle are the knowledge areas. The one that you see under develop project charter is integration, and the one that you see under identify stakeholder is a stakeholder knowledge area. So moving on, what is a project charter? A charter is a fairly simple document outlining a few things like project description, what are the project objectives, the scope of the project, rough idea of cost and timelines, the various constraints, the high-level risks, and so on and so forth. To put it in a simple term, it's like the birth certificate of why this project exists. Now, this project charter is authorized by someone called as a project sponsorer, and it basically provides the project manager the authority to apply the organization resources to the project activities. Now, this process, the second process, which is identify stakeholder. Now, before that, who are these stakeholders? A stakeholder is any person or an entity that has any kind of interest. It may be positive or negative. A stakeholder can be your supplier, a client, they could be your project team, management team, the sponsor. Now, all these are my stakeholders. Now, in this process of identify stakeholder, the project manager does something called as stakeholder analysis to better understand the level of influence, the impact they have on the project, whether they have high level of power or low level of power, and also the interest level of these stakeholders. Now, it's very important for you to understand that these two processes run in parallel. It's not done separate. So let's move on to the next process group, which is planning. Here is where all the fun starts. This is where we try to understand how exactly we are planning to do our project. So this is where the big master plan is developed. So to execute a smooth and successful project, work towards making that better project plan. So remember, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So with that note, let's move on with the first process, which is develop project management plan. So this is where we develop a roadmap or the master plan as to how the project will be managed. Like I mentioned earlier, this is not a one-time event, but it will be progressively elaborated as the project proceeds. Now this plan outlines everything on how changes are made to the document, be it artifacts, and also most importantly, the changes made to the other subsequent plans like the scope, schedule, quality, risk, and other subsequent plans. So we need to plan a lot of other areas to plan for the project. So the first one we do here is determine what are we doing in the projects as well as what we are not doing in the project, which means the scope. So the next process is plan scope management. Okay, before I explain the plan scope management, you will see many times here plan scope, plan schedule, plan risk, plan quality, and other. So every time we talk about the plan and management of any specific knowledge area, remember, it means that we are talking about the rules of the game here. So coming back to the current process, which is scope management area. So this is where we determine how the scope will be managed, which means how it will be defined, validated, and controlled. Example, if someone wants to add some scope to the project, will you accept it or not? Will it be approved? And who will approve it? What level of improvement will be documented in the plan scope management? All these will be defined in this plan. So with that said, let's move on to the next process, which is collective requirements. First of all, what is a requirement? Requirements are something that basically I need to deliver the project objectives. So understanding what stakeholder wants, what are their requirements. Now there are various types of requirements, right, that you need to gather, be it business requirements, functional requirements, technical requirements, quality requirements, and many others. So let's take an example of an e-commerce website, let's say. Now, what are the stakeholder requirements here? Let's start with the end users. As an end user or a shopper, my requirement is to be able to log in and view the products with the prices and make a secure purchase. Secondly, as an administrator of the e-commerce website, I should be able to modify the list of products and adjust the offering over times. Likewise, I'll collect the requirements from other stakeholders like fulfillment specialist and the requirements of the security administrator of the website, which generally comes in the form of something called as a user stories. Also, there are multiple ways to collect requirements like one-on-one interview, Delphi technique, nominal group technique, and many other fancy types, which you can go through the PMBOK guide and understand that. So if you ask me, you can stick to the good old meetings, gather all those required stakeholders, and collect the requirements and get a sign off. So with the requirements collected, we can move on to the next process, which is define scope. Here is where we define what's included in the project, what is excluded by using the requirements that we just collected. and come up with a project scope statement. Remember, a good project manager will make sure that there is absolutely no ambiguity in terms of scope, which means there is no gray areas on what's in the scope and what's out of the scope of the project. Now, remember, the project scope statement should have various things in it, like deliverables, constraints, assumptions, justification, success criteria. All these would be defined in project scope statement. Now, once the scope is defined, we will move on with something called creating work breakdown structure. So the next process is create WBS. This is again an important planning process for breaking down the scope of the project. Now, WBS more or less looks like an organization chart where you split your project deliverables and break it into smaller and much more manageable pieces of work. So here is where we will decompose those deliverables which are outlined in the scope statement, which I just explained, all the way till something called as a work packages. Remember, the work packages are the things and not the actions. So let me explain this WBS with a simple example of, let's say, building a house. Now, you can break it down into foundation, flooring, building the walls, roof, and other things, right? So again, we further break down the foundation into uh, drawing a layout, digging a hole, pouring a concrete, right? Now, here, concrete, which I just mentioned, will be the work package, which I just told you is the lowest level on WBS. So, moving on, let me remind you of one key concept here. The scope baseline is the combination of scope statement plus WBS plus WBS dictionary. Remember this key concept here. Now, what is a WBS dictionary? It's basically a document that basically describes each component of the WBS with milestones, deliverables, activity, scope, sometimes resources, costs, quality. All these will be mentioned in WBS dictionary. Uh, I want to give you another key concept here. If you do not uh, if you do not define all the work packages in WBS properly, then we are prone for something called as a scope creep. Now, what is a scope creep? Scope creep, sorry. It's basically a scope extending its boundaries. Let's take an example of a website design project. If any specific demand comes up during the course of the project to add an unplanned feature to the website layout, which was not agreed during the planning process, then it's a scope creep. Hope you are getting the point here. So here is where the project manager has to put his foot down and say, this was not agreed at the initial stage, at the planning stage, and it was not signed off in the scope baseline, especially defined inside the WBS dictionary. And anything added to it will be a scope creep, which will go through something called as an integrated change management process, which I will take you guys through later in the monitoring and control process group. Moving on to the next process, which is plan schedule management. So this is where I plan on how I will manage my timelines for the project or the schedules. Example, what will I do if someone asks or some tasks gets extended on the timelines? How am I planning to calculate those durations? What are the tools that I will use to calculate those? What is a precision value that I will stick to? How precise do I need to be when I set the activity duration? All these will be defined in the plan scope management. Moving on to the next one, which is define activities. Now, please pay attention here. We had created the WBS earlier in scope management, right? And what was the bottommost component of WBS? It was work packages. Now, here is where we define what activities are required to deliver those work packages. For example, in the same construction that I took earlier, the work package was foundation, right? Work package under foundation was concrete. Now, what are the activities involved? It will be mixing concrete is one of the activities. Pour concrete to the ground, which is dug, right? It's another activity. So it's the mixing concrete and the activity that is defined here. Once the activities are defined, we will go ahead and sequence them, which will take us to the next process, which is sequence activities. Now this is where I create a sequence of activities, as in which activity will come first and which one will come next, as well as which are the activities I can do in parallel. Now here is where we talk about start to start, start to finish, finish to start, and finish to finish activities. Basically understanding the dependencies between those activities, and join those activities. Every predecessor activity should be linked to the successor activity, except it's at the end of the project. So once we are done with sequencing, let's go ahead and estimate the activity duration, sorry. So that's the next process. Now, based on the activities which was sequenced earlier in the previous process, we will determine how long will these activities take to complete. Are we talking about 50 hours worked in a work week by two people or one person? Or is it 50 hours that needs to be spanned across months because we are waiting for some dependencies, like some, let's say, a lab results are awaited. It has to be available. Uh, so we use multiple tools and techniques here to estimate. Couple of example I can think of is analogous estimation is one of the example, a parametric estimation, and couple of others which you can go through in a PMBOK guide. Moving on to the next process, which is develop schedule. Now, what is a schedule? Is it a Gantt chart, or is it a network diagram, or the activities listed in the tools like MS Project you must have seen, or a Primavera? Yes, it is all that. It's any kind of a display of how the project will be placed over time to deliver the scope which is predefined. Now we are done with the scope and schedule. We have to look into the cost as well, right? Now, before that, let me give you some of the key concepts under schedule, which is fast tracking and crashing. Now, what is a fast tracking? Fast tracking means performing more activities in parallel instead of sequential. Crashing means shortening the duration of the activities by adding more resources to the activities. For example, if two workers can finish the activities in 40 days, then how long will it take with four workers? It would be 20 days, right? That's what crashing means. Moving on with the cost, the next process would be plan cost management. Again, like I mentioned earlier on the scope and schedule, it's basically the rules of the game as to how I will manage the cost here. For example, who has the approval to spend money? If the cost of the resource is over budget, who will be approving that? All these will be defined here. The next process would be estimate cost. Here again, we estimate how much each activities will cost. As simple as that. Knowing that I have my schedule, I can develop the budget for the project. The next one is develop budget. We are determining the entire budget of the project. This is where I know how much I will be spending as I understand my S curve. S curve, again, you can go through the PMBOK guide and understand much more in detail. Moving on to the next one, which is plan quality management. Again, same stuff as I explained earlier. It's the rule of the quality. What is quality for me, for the project as a whole? What's my quality standard for the project? All these will be defined here. Moving on to the next one, plan resource management. Here again, what is the rule for planning to recruit? Should I hire people or should I use internal resources? Should I buy some material from external vendor or should I produce internally? All these will be outlined here. The next one would be estimate activity resources. This is something new as per the new version, PMBOK 6th edition, because this process was used to be in project time management in the earlier version. Now pay attention here. This process go hand in hand with estimate activity duration. They are done together because we need to know which resources I have to estimate the time. For example, one worker can build a roof in 10 days. That's what estimating activity resources mean. Moving on with plan communication management. Here again, like I mentioned in all the other plans, we will build a plan as to who, what, how much, when, where the communication is done. Now remember, This is a key area as a project manager will spend almost 90% of his time communicating. So the next process is plan risk management. Here is where we plan how we will approach risk management. Here is where we plan for the uncertainty in the project. So we will ask ourselves as an organization, what's my risk tolerance? What's the risk appetite? All these will be defined here. Next process is identify risk. Identify those negative risks or threats, or it may be positive risk or opportunities. Let's suppose we may list down some 100 risks in the project. 100 things may happen, both positive and negative. Now, can we consider all of them? No, right? Now, this is where we do two things. The first one is qualitative risk analysis. We perform something called as a qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. So, talking about qualitative risk, here the main aim is to rank the risk from top to bottom. We rank the risk based on some kind of standards or scale. We can rank them on a scale of 1 to 5 and think about risk urgency as to which are those risks we should be taking care of it right away, else there will be a bigger impact to the project as a whole. And the next process that like I mentioned is perform perform quantitative risk analysis. This is where the project manager and the team, along with any other relevant stakeholder, should quantitatively analyze the risk from dollar perspective, remember that, or from resource hour perspective. This is where we multiply the probability of the event occurring and the impact of the risk. We come up with something called as a risk magnitude or the expected monetary value. So here is where we identify which are those risks which we will be taking care of and which are the risks which we will not be taking care of. Moving on to the next one, which is plan risk responses. For all those identified risks we just mentioned earlier, we need to have potential responses. What can I do to protect my project from the risk? Will I have to buy an insurance to transfer the risk? Will I mitigate the risk by making some changes to the scope or have some more financial reserves? There are some risks that we can't do much about it, right? But we have to just accept those risks or completely avoid it by not even getting into that area. So these are the various responses to the risks identified as worth taking care of. Moving on to the next one, which is plan procurement management, another important planning process. Here is where we determine, do we need to procure any services or goods from external firm or make things internally? We take a call on whether to buy the goods from outside or should we make within the process within the company. Moving on to the last but not the least process, which is plan stakeholder engagement. In the initiating process group, we had identified stakeholders. Remember that? Now we need to understand what I need to do with the stakeholder based on the influence and power by grouping them. For example, we have a senior leader who is also the project sponsorer who falls under the high influence and high power and needs a special type of communication. Get the point here? This is what we do here in plan stakeholder engagement. How well I need to engage those stakeholders to make sure the best outcome of the projects. All right, let's talk about executing process group. Now, this is where we take all the plans we have just created and put them into action. We basically complete the work which we have defined in the project management plan. So here is where the focus of the project manager on managing the team, following the process, resolve conflicts amongst the stakeholder or the team members, guide the team to stick to the plan. So the key here is if the planning is done to perfection, then executing those tasks or activities will be a cakewalk. With that said, moving on to the first process, which is direct and manage project work. It's pretty self explanatory, right? As the name says, the project manager will direct and manage the resources to complete the objective of the project. So here is where the project manager will ensure the team is performing the work defined in the project management plan and implementing all those approved changes to achieve the ultimate objective.
Moving on to the next one, which is manage project knowledge. Now, this is a new process which has been introduced into PMBOK 6. Simply put, this is nothing but your lessons learned. In PMBOK 5, an earlier version, it was actually written under the closing process group. Now, the emphasis is more on documenting the lessons right from the beginning so that nothing falls between the cracks. Moving on to the next process, which is manage quality. In this process, we ensure the results are that we are getting from direct and managed project work are reasonable in terms of quality. Moving on to the next one, which is acquire resources. So what we do here is we basically hire the team members or we buy materials. So we acquire all those resources required to execute the project. Now, let me ask you this question. Why is this process not under planning process group, but it is under executing? Come on, think. All right, let me tell you. This is under execution because resource is equal to money, right? So we cannot keep the resources waiting. So resources waiting is equal to loss of money, which will affect my overall budget. So a good project manager will acquire the resources at the right time for execution. Remember that. Moving on to the next one, which is develop team. So this is where we train, develop, and mentor and equip. Basically, we equip the team members so that they can execute the project work. So here the project manager work as a servant leader, basically removing all those obstacles for the team members to function as one single team. So the key goal here is to equip the team members to develop the skill to better execute what we have planned. Moving on to the next one, which is manage team. This is more of an operational aspect of the team, right from managing the leaves of the team members to the team members' availability. When are the resources available? When are they not? And all the way to tracking the team members' performance. How are they performing? Anybody is performing well, or is there somebody performing underperforming? What kind of feedback do they require? You know, considering providing those constructive feedback for the better outcome of the project. Also resolving the team members' issues in case if there is any, and managing team changes to basically optimize the project performance. That's what managed team is all about. Moving on to the next one, which is managed communication. Now, this is where you are actively communicating to all the stakeholders. So this is where we collect, distribute, store, and retrieve all those project information according to the communication management plan that we had discussed earlier. So, like for example, the information like where are all the status reports stored, how often do we have the team meetings, and all these things are outlined in this process. The next one is implement risk responses. This is again new process added to the executing process. Now, what is the difference between plan risk responses and implement risk responses? Hope you remember that the plan risk responses was under the planning process group, right? Okay, it's pretty simple. As the name says, we plan for the responses during the planning process group, and here during execution, we execute those what we have planned. Like for example, uh, we had planned to buy the insurance, let's say, and this is where we actually go ahead and buy or purchase the insurance. Likewise, all those actions identified under the risk register is performed in this process. Moving on to the next one, which is conduct procurement. This is where we carry out all those bidding process by having the bidder conferences, by reviewing all the proposals that which was received, that was sent in, and selecting the right seller for the project. Moving on to the next one, which is manage stakeholder engagement. So this is where the project manager and the team are making sure that the stakeholders are aware of what he or she needs to be aware of. Now, this is where the project manager will ensure that we have the commitment of the stakeholders at all the stages of the project, and also their expectations are met.
So this is where we'll check if the approach we are taking is working or not. So we will check if someone or any of the stakeholder is gaining power, or is someone losing interest on the project. So here is, if it is yes, and how do I create the interest level so that he is coming back to the project for the better project completion. So all these will be outlined in this process. On with the next process group, monitoring and control. Now, remember, monitoring and control runs in parallel with the execution process group. This is where we, as a project manager, spend most of the time, whereas project team was spending most of the time in the previous process group in executing. So this is where we track, review, uh, basically we track and review the process and progress the performance of the project, and we basically identify any changes are required to the original plan. So this is where we compare plan versus actual. So we start reporting the performance of the project and make decisions on what appropriate actions are required. So with all this in mind, let's move on to the first process, which is the part of the integration knowledge area, which is monitor and control project work. Now here we measure the performance of the project against the plan, as simple as that. The key benefit here is that it allows the stakeholders to understand the current state of the project. And if something is not going as per the plan, we create change request, which is the important outcome or output of this particular process. Moving on to the next one, which is perform integrated change control. Now, this is a very, very important process. Always remember, every project will go through changes, right? So there's no way that the things will go as per the plan. Now pay attention here. It says integrated change. What it means is, if there is a change to any of the constraints, like for example, if there is a change in scope, how will it affect my schedule, and subsequently how will it affect my cost? So all the changes are properly documented and integrated. So the change control board will review all the changes, all the change requests, and basically they make a decision if they have to be approved or any changes has to be rejected. And all these will be documented in something called as a change log. Moving on to the next one, which is validate scope. This process is basically focusing on obtaining the final project uh, acceptance, I would say, acceptance from the customer. So here the customer will basically review the deliverables and validate that the entire scope and the requirement, what was needed, is present in those deliverables. So the next process is control scope. Here the project manager will make sure that no one is adding extras to the scope. And the project manager will make sure that there is no gold plating. If something has to go through, like getting added to the scope or removing something, like I mentioned earlier, it will follow the perform integrated change control process. The next one is control schedule. Here, the project manager makes sure that the team is on schedule and there are no delays. Here, the project manager will manage changes, if there are any, to the schedule baseline to achieve the plan. That if it's a 6 month project, are we successfully delivering within 6 months or not? That is what the project manager will ensure. The next process is control cost. Again, the project manager is controlling those cost expenditure to make sure that they are being spent on what was identified, nothing more, nothing less. Next one is control quality. The question here was, we as a project need to ask is, are we doing things right? Here is where the project manager must aspire to check every deliverables, whether it's good to go to the customer or not. Please make a note here. The validate scope is done by the customer, and control quality is done internally by the project manager and the team before it is actually reaching the customer. The next process is control resources. Now, what do you mean by that? Do we need to add or reduce resources, or do we have any sufficient resources? Are they performing in the level of what I want? That's what we ask in this process. Moving on to the next one, which is monitor communication. This is where the project manager and the team is involved in managing communication, if it's as per the plan or not. It will go through the change process if it is not. The next process is monitor risk. Now, why do we need to monitor risk? Uh, let's say if one of the risk item which is ranked low as part of the perform qualitative risk analysis, and suddenly something happened and the risk become very high and it becomes critical. uh, Example, some of the products to be supplied by the vendors are shutting down, then the risks become suddenly high, right? So this is where we need to start monitoring all those risks. Moving on to the next one, which is control procurement. This is where I make payment for all those goods and services that I have received, and basically I take care of all those procurements which I have planned for. Moving on to the next one, which is monitor stakeholder engagement. Now, why do we monitor them? Because, like I mentioned earlier, things will change, organizations change, organization structures change. Many people will join, many people will leave the organization. So all these will become my new customers, my new stakeholders, right? So those things has to be managed effectively in this process. All right, so we have finally reached the closing process group. Now that we have finished the product or service or an end result which is already delivered to the customer and is accepted, is the project over? No, it's not yet. Still some work needs to be done, right? Now remember, by now the customer has checked and approved the deliverables. So the final one is close project or phase. This is the last and the final process. Now here is where we will close out a phase within a project, or we could close out a project as a whole. In parallel, we close out all those procurements by making all the payments to all the vendors and closing and signing off as per the agreement. So with that, we have completed all the 5 process group. I hope you're able to take some kind of knowledge from this session. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.